Hey, hi, how are you? When identifying and assessing and considering the controls for hazards, terms get bandied about and often incorrectly. So let's look at some of these terms in this segment today. Let's talk about those terms we've covered, what a hazard is, but also let's talk about two other terms, risk and consequence. So, this episode, hazard versus risk versus consequence. So now we know and understand what a hazard is. It's a situation, condition, or thing that may be dangerous to health and safety of workers, for example. But what is risk? Now, I once had the opportunity to have a safety chat with some cabinetry folks. And when it came to risk, I asked them what was the greatest risk they were likely to encounter in their work when using a table saw. Of course, they answered, well, cutting themselves, or at a minimum, cutting their hands. Were they wrong? Stick around. I'll answer that at the end of this lesson. But let's look at some definitions. So this one from the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, or from the CCOHS, risk is the chance or probability that a person will be harmed or experience an adverse health effect if exposed to a hazard. It may also apply to situations where there's property or equipment loss or harmful effects on the environment. For example, the risk of developing cancer from smoking cigarettes could be expressed as cigarette smokers are 12 times, for example, more likely to die of lung cancer than non-smokers. Or the number per 100,000 smokers who will develop lung cancer. Actual number, of course, depends on factors such as their age and how many years they've been smoking. These risks are expressed as a probability or likelihood of developing a disease or getting injured, whereas hazard refers to the agent responsible. In this case, the example, smoking. Factors that influence the degree or likelihood of risk are the nature of the exposure, how much a person is exposed to a hazardous thing or condition, for example, several times a day or once a year, and we'll talk more about that in later lessons. How the person is exposed, for example, are they breathing in vapor or is it by skin contact? And of course, the severity of the effect. For example, one substance may cause skin cancer while the other may cause skin irritation. Cancer is much more of a severe effect and serious effect than irritation. Another definition of risk, this one from WorkSafe BC, and that is risk means the chance of injury or occupational disease. It's quite narrow and only focuses on harm to humans, excluding any notion about property or assets. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Now, this one from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, or OSHA, and that's the chance or probability that a person will be harmed or experience an adverse health effect if exposed to a hazard. It should also be noted that risk can also be applied to a situation with equipment or property loss. Risk is the chance or probability of the manifestation of the consequence after interaction with or exposure to the hazard. It's also important to consider that risk increases as exposure increases. Thinking back to our cabinetry folks earlier, in that earlier example, they're more apt to exposure to hazards associated with a table saw because they're using it several times a day versus using the table saw once a week or even less. So when we're talking about risk of exposure to moving blades, it increases as frequency of the exposure to the unguarded blade increases. Or the risk of musculoskeletal injuries increases each time material is lifted up onto the table saw deck. Risk can be better described as the probability of experiencing loss or consequence if exposed to a hazard. Keep it simple. When we're thinking about all of these things, we have to understand that consequence is a little different. Consequence is the negative result after exposure to the hazard resulting in that loss. And the other thing we always have to consider is no matter what, there's always a loss. Even when there is exposure to a hazard, and even if nothing happens, there's always a loss. So when you're exposed to a hazard, even if nothing happens, a near miss, there's going to be a loss because a near miss takes time to investigate. Or some of you might call it a close call, takes time to investigate. On a previous note, there always seems to be a condition around loss. So let's talk about that confusion and let's dig into that a bit. A near miss equals no loss. No. Okay, really? If you ignore it, whatever it was, it will occur again. It's a fact. And it might be worse, so it needs to be investigated. Investigations, regardless of impact, complexity, or magnitude, will always take time and resources. Which leads me to the next point. We've got time. No, you don't. Time is simply time, but it is something you're never going to be able to get back or regain or put in the bank. If it's lost, it's lost. You can't restock it. You can't put it back in the bank. Once it is lost, it is lost. So regardless of what anyone thinks or tells you, it's the most precious commodity you have. So don't waste it on investigations if you don't have to. Not meaning don't do them, but learn from them. But don't do them if you don't have to. The other one here is it's only stuff. Wrong. Maybe it was only stuff that got wrecked or damaged. Maybe it was like a wall that got scarred or bruised or like damaged or a box or something. But that undesired or uncontrolled force could be directed at a person next time, which is why I don't accept the notion of being an incident being when only a person gets hurt. And near misses or close calls can involve property. No. If there's damage to inanimate objects or people, it's a loss and it needs to be investigated. Near misses or close calls involve both people and property. And the next one, well, at least they didn't work for us. I've heard this many times. That's why we hire contractors to transfer risk. Maybe, but not always. There's always risk, and it's a complex subject, and maybe more about that for another day. But they're people too. Let's talk a little bit more about loss. It's about loss. Let's better understand loss. First is the human factor. We, of course, always equate loss to human, injury, permanent disability, or worse, death. The next one, money. Now, unfortunately, some folks don't look at what most may figure as the most important or crucial loss, and that's people, but they look at the loss of money as the most important. However, one thing to note, every loss has monetary loss. The next one is time. Well, most time is equated to a monetary loss, and truthfully it is. However, we still need to accurately identify loss and appropriate it correctly, and do that in order to better reduce risk. While delays, think large project delays or lost time equate to monetary loss, we still need to consider where the loss is. Time is in fact money, but money is not necessarily time because you cannot buy time. And then finally, the other one is property. One of the most important considerations to make is people look at property or asset loss as nothing more than a mere near miss. However, let's look at that property damage and understand it is a loss on a few different factors. There's the monetary loss, the cost of the property, but also look at this. Were there people exposed to that same hazard? Or are they trickle-down effects from that damage? If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead, weigh in the comments. For those of you that are on the learning platform, it gives you some more food for thought. Feel free to reach out through email. But once again, also think of this. What if there was a person there next time? Damage to property and damage to people needs to be investigated the same way. And now, the next thing is, let's look at definitions defining risk and loss in your OHSMS, or your Occupational Health and Safety Management System. Legislations provide consistency. However, here's a little piece of trivia. Definitions of risk differ widely across jurisdictions. The other thing is, legislation also infers compliance. And it's a good thing to mirror that legislation because then it can help to substantiate your OHSMS documents. But no matter what, you need to remain consistent. However you define risk and loss, keep it consistent throughout your Occupational Health and Safety Management System, or your OHSMS. The same needs to be applied across all of your definitions in your OHSMS. Let's just do a quick bit of review. Okay, let's look at categories of hazards. I know we covered this in a previous lesson, but this sort of helps tie everything together. First, we want to talk about physical hazards. Think of that tripping hazard, such as broken stair nosing or that rolled up carpet at the entrance to a workplace. Physical hazard, but also that environment that you're working in can have physical hazards. And now the next one, of course, is chemical. And I've said hazards, chemical in nature. A severe exposure of note might be exposure to caustic chemicals or contact with caustic chemicals. The next one is biological. This could be something like exposure to molds or bacteria or even viruses. And then finally, psychosocial hazards. Now, exposure to frequent harassment can lead to psychological harm. So it's easy to note that harassment is a psychosocial hazard. So let's think about a bit of recapping here, so to speak. Okay? And that is that hazards adversely affect safety and the health of people and cause damage to property and assets leading to loss. The big notion here is avoiding loss. Peter Drucker, a very famous business icon, said, "The first order of business is not increasing profit, but minimizing loss." The other thing to note is risk is the probability of loss occurring after exposure to a hazard. If you're on YouTube, please, by all means, go ahead. Feel free to weigh in with your definitions. And here's a little bit of trivia for you once again. There are no consistent definitions, legal definitions of risk in Canada. There's there's the difficulty. Because risk means different things to different people and in different contexts. So go ahead, throw your definitions in the comments down below if you want. And once again, if you're on the learning platform, it gives you more food for thought, and feel free to reach out by email and message me and give me your thoughts as well. Once again, we think about risk is the probability of a manifestation of consequence after interaction with exposure to a hazard. So now that we have all of that, let's put it all together. Let's think about it this way. Risk is the chance or probability of the manifestation of a consequence after interaction with or exposure to a hazard. So hazard is not risk. Hazard leads to risk. Increased risk leads to probable consequence. On that note, the question, what is the greatest risk then for folks using a table saw? If you're considering the operators are lifting and moving material far more than they are exposed to that moving blade, you might note that the risk of developing musculoskeletal injuries or MSIs are greater due to the exposure to awkward positions, overexertion, and frequent lifting. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're not subscribed already, you should click that little subscribe button down below and ding the bell, and you'll get notified when the next video in this series launches. Now, if you're on the learning platform, there's a short quiz, 5 questions that you'll need to take to ensure this module is complete. Once that's done, you can move on to the next module, which is understanding controls. Oh, and for you folks on YouTube, you can check out this video up here. Remember, safety leaders, being a leader is doing the right thing at the right place at the right time, regardless of who's watching. And because, well, you know something? Somebody likely is. Okay? Take care. Bye for now.